We're in the book of John, and we're going to be talking in the 19th chapter about Jesus' trial and some details that we can perceive. A lot of us know the story, but let's look at some details and ask ourselves some hard questions. And we're going to do that when we come right back. Hi, and welcome to Bible Study with Friends, where our goal is to help you get more impact from your Bible study. I'm here with my friend Sherry Mangrum, and we're in the book of John, the 19th chapter, talking about the crucifixion of our Lord Jesus Christ. And we hope this is a blessing. If it is, be sure to hit the subscribe and the like button and help us to get to 1,000 subscribers. We're coming along just great. We hope you enjoy this video. Last week, we saw the trial before Pilate begin. And one of the things I want to show you, because we're going to talk about it more today, last chapter is verse 38, where Pilate said, after talking with Jesus and saying, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus said, "Yes, I am." And he said, they had that whole discussion about the truth. The end of verse 38 says that Pilate said to the Jews, "I find no guilt in him." And that's the first of 3 times, Sherry, that during the trial, Pilate says he's not guilty. I
Yes.
find no guilt in him at all. And yet, even though Jesus is not guilty, he's going to be found guilty. And we're going to see some of the pressure on Pilate today. And I'm going to discuss the idea that Pilate may not be a totally bad guy. He's just a weak guy. And we're going to see that as we go into chapter 19. So he's already declared Jesus innocent once. And we're going to go starting at verse 1. We're going to go and look at some of these. Why don't you read verse 1 to verse 3 just to get us started?
Pilate then took Jesus and scourged him. And the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and put a purple robe on him. And they began to come up to him and say, "Hail, King of the Jews!" and to give him slaps in the face.
Now, a couple things that strike me about these verses. Number one, John knows by the time he's writing this in the late 80s, even early 90s perhaps, that Christians know the story. They've read Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They're already out. They've read the details. Luke and Matthew and Mark all go into much more details about Jesus' treatment with the Roman soldiers. And John is just trying to give us a feel for the trial and making a point that the other writers don't make, and that is for us to get an insight into why Pilate gave in. And we look at the treatment that Jesus received from the Roman soldiers. And this isn't the Roman soldiers attacking Jesus. This is the Roman soldiers being anti-Semitic. These are attacks against the Jews. They're trying to humiliate the Jews by humiliating the person who claims to be the king of the Jews. So they're making fun of him as the king of the Jews in order to humiliate him. Now, Pilate is permitting this because I think of a motivation that we'll see here in a second. So now going on to verse 4, we see this exchange between Pilate and the Lord. And now we're going to see another exchange between Pilate and the crowd. When Pilate came out, remember he's in the Praetorium, the Jews won't go in. So he goes in, talks to Jesus, then he comes out again, and he says to them, the Jewish crowd, and he says, "Behold, I am bringing him out to you so that you may know that I find no guilt in him." This is the second time that he has made this statement that Jesus, I find him not guilty.
Yes.
Now, back in last chapter, Do you remember the first time they bring Jesus to Pilate? He says, "What is this?" And they say, "He is an evildoer." And he says, where's the evidence? And they said, "If he wasn't an evildoer, we would not have brought him to you." Now, they're trying to exert legal pressure on Pilate, that there is a legal reason for Jesus to be on trial. He's an evildoer. Okay?
Yeah.
And Pilate says, "I find no guilt in him," about the legal pressure because there's no evidence. So now he's saying a second time, "I find no guilt in him." And let's look and see what pressure the crowd places next. Go ahead and read from verse 5 down to verse 7.
Jesus then came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, "Behold the man."
Now, what Pilate is trying to do here is he's trying to get the crowd to feel sorry for Jesus as the king. Here's your king. Here's the guy, and he's all beat up, and now he's got a purple robe around him and this crown of thorns, that this is your king. Aren't you at least patriotically stirred up to have pity on him?
Okay.
You see what he's doing?
Yes.
All right. So then he says, "Behold the man." And when the chief priests and the officers saw him, verse 6, they cried out, "Crucify." And Pilate said to them, "Take him yourself and crucify him. I find no guilt in him." Third time. Now, we could say that the idea that Jesus is sinless was made up by Christians hundreds of years later with the idea that Jesus was sinless, that none of the writers of the New Testament said he was sinless. But yet we have verses. We get Paul, John, and Peter, three different writers who are all going to reinforce this idea of Jesus is absolutely not guilty of any wrong, is sinless. Look at 2 Corinthians 5:21.
He made him who knew no sin to be sin on our behalf, so that we might become the righteousness of God in him.
So here's Paul saying Jesus knew no sin and yet died on the cross. Now, John, look at 1 John chapter 3, verse 5.
Okay. You know that he appeared in order to take away sins, and in him there is no sin.
So here's John saying, in Jesus, there's no sin at all, yet he goes to the cross. Now, Peter, the best friend of Christ, look at 1 Peter chapter 2, and we're going to read 21 to 24.
For you have been called for this purpose, since Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example for you to follow in his steps, who committed no sin, nor was any deceit found in his mouth. And while being reviled, he did not revile in return. While suffering, he uttered no threats, but kept entrusting himself to him who judges righteously.
So here we have proof in the first century, the writers of the New Testament, the major writers, John, Paul, and Peter, all said Jesus died sinless. So they agree with there is no guilt in him.
Yeah.
Now we go back and let's look at how the crowd reacted to that. When in verse 6, Pilate says for the third time, "I find no guilt in him." Let's read verse 7 and 8.
The Jews answered him, "We have a law, and by that law he ought to die because he made himself out to be the Son of God." Therefore, when Pilate heard the statement, he was even more afraid.
Now, it's interesting because it says he was more afraid. So he was afraid already.
Yep.
Now, we know, turn to Matthew chapter 27, verse 19. Why was Pilate afraid before this, and now he was afraid even more? Go ahead and read that verse.
While he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent him a message saying, "Have nothing to do with that righteous man, for last night I suffered greatly in a dream because of him."
So his wife had sent him a message during the trial saying, I had a dream. Jesus is not guilty. And
Right.
you better be careful to have nothing to do with him. So
Yeah.
he was already fearful. And now, in the statement that the people made, and now they're exerting some religious pressure. We saw legal pressure up with he's an evildoer. But now they're exerting religious pressure saying he said he was the Son of God.
Yeah, because how many times do you think his wife ever interrupted him during any of
Exactly.
trials that he had?
Exactly. Now, why to a Roman, why would the statement, he claims to be the Son of God, why would that scare a Roman governor? If you
Why
do a
would
little
it?
research, you find out that Caesar claimed to be the Son of God and therefore God, right? So what they're exerting here is not just religious pressure of he's a Jew who's claiming to be the son of the Jewish God. No, he is a Jew who's claiming to be on the same level that Caesar claims to be. You see why that would be scary to a Roman governor.
Very much, yes.
So they're exerting religious pressure, not Jewish religious pressure, but Roman religious pressure when they say he
Mhm.
claims to be the Son of God, because that's Caesar's claim.
Wow, I
So there's
didn't
some
know that.
pressure. And so he's even more afraid because now he's got a message from his wife, and now they're trying to exert some religious pressure. Now, so let's go on because we're going to see a third. And so we have this idea in verse 8 that he's even more afraid. And now I want you to read from verse 9 down to verse 12. And we're going to see the last pressure that is exerted on Pilate.
And he entered into the praetorium again and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. So Pilate said to him, "You do not speak to me? Do you not know that I have authority to release you and I have authority to crucify you?" Jesus answered, "You would have no authority over me unless it had been given you from above. For this reason, he who delivered me to you has the greater sin."
Now,
As a
let's stop there for a second. A couple of things are happening here. Pilate basically says, they say that you're claiming to be the Son of God. Where are you from? And he will not answer. Now, that fulfills a prophecy of Isaiah 53, verse 7, that says he refuses to answer when he's accused.
Yes.
So that's a fulfillment of prophecy that Jesus refuses to answer him at this point. Earlier, when he said, "Are you a king?" he didn't refuse to answer that. But now the accusation is about being the Son of God. And so Jesus is silent to fulfill that prophecy. And so he says, "Don't you know I've got authority?" And Jesus makes this famous statement of, you don't have any authority unless God gives it to you. And the significant thing is, God put Pilate in this spot in order to fulfill the eternal plan of salvation. Jesus has to die on the cross. And the only way Jesus can die on the cross is if the governor of Rome declares he is to die on the cross. The Jews can't kill him. They're not allowed. So Pilate, he says, you don't have authority except the authority that God has given you to fulfill his plan. See that?
Yes.
Now, the next thing that happens after he says that, it says, "For this reason," she says, "you have no authority over me verse 11, unless it has been given to you from above. For this reason, because the authority to kill me has been given you by God, because of that, he who delivered me to you has the greater sin. Now, there is a huge discussion whether this is talking about Judas Iscariot having the greater sin, or whether it's Caiaphas, the high priest, who knew these accusations were false. Both men had betrayed Christ, and both men knew better. So there's a real discussion whether it's Judas or Caiaphas, the high priest, and we don't know. All we know is that they're going to be held responsible for their sin.
Yeah.
And Pilate is really off the hook because he is fulfilling God's plan to have Jesus die on the cross. So Pilate is not the bad guy here.
It could ultimately be both of them.
Sure, it could be. Sure. Yeah. That betrayal could be both. We
I
don't know.
don't think, yeah.
But it says that the only way you can do this to me is if God allows it. So you're being used by God, as were these other guys, but they know better. Judas knew who he was and betrayed him. Caiaphas knows he's not guilty and yet betrays him. It's up to us to really decide on that issue, but it's a moot issue. It doesn't really matter to the story of Jesus going to the cross, not by Pilate's authority, but by God's authority, using Pilate as a tool.
And that's the point.
And that's the point. So Pilate is not a bad guy. He's a weak guy because he gives in to these pressures. And the last pressure that he gives into, look at verse 12.
As a result of this, Pilate made efforts to release him. But the Jews cried out, saying, "If you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar. Everyone who makes himself out to be a king opposes Caesar."
Now, do you see the political pressure there?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
You have made it very clear.
So he's had legal pressure put on, and he says he's not guilty. He's had religious pressure put on, and he says he's not guilty. Now he's having political pressure, and the political pressure is going to do him in because he does not want to be accused by Caesar of not being loyal. So we have the word in verse 13, therefore.
Yeah.
Therefore, when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down in the judgment seat at a place called the Pavement, and known in Hebrew as Gabbatha. And he said, okay, this is the judgment. Behold your king. And he's going to give one more shot at saying, don't you feel sorry? This is Passover time, and it's about 6 a.m, Roman time. Now, and a Roman governor is going to use Roman time, not Jewish time. Now, a Roman day starts at midnight. So the 6th hour would be 6 a.m. A Jewish day starts at sunrise, which is about 6 a.m. So the 6th hour would be in the afternoon. But it's very early in the day of Passover. That's why they're going to hurriedly crucify him and get him down off the cross before Passover. So it's probably 6 a.m, very early.
Okay.
And he said, behold your king. And they cried out, away with him, crucify him. Pilate said to them, shall I crucify your king? See, he's trying to get them some patriotic feelings here. And the chief priest answered, we have no king but Caesar. And that is a lie. Because the Jews were up in arms revolting against Caesar.
Yes.
So to say, we have no king but Caesar, and you better let him go to the cross because otherwise you're not a friend of Caesar, that is just political pressure.
Yes, yes.
It's a way of putting pressure on Pilate to get Pilate to do what the high priest wants him to do, and that is kill Jesus. Because the high priest doesn't have authority to do it.
Wow.
So we have a chance here of saying, in our lives, when we're dealing with sin and feeling guilty, what kind of pressure do we have a tendency to put on God? Do we try to make God feel guilty? I tried and I failed. You better forgive me. Otherwise, I tried and you're not being very nice. God doesn't
Yeah.
give in to political pressure. He doesn't give in to religious pressure. He doesn't give in to legal pressure.
Thank God.
So go ahead and read from verse 17 down to verse 22.
They took Jesus, therefore, and he went out, bearing his own cross, to the place called the place of a skull, which is called in Hebrew Golgotha. There they crucified him, and with him 2 other men, one on either side, and Jesus in between. Pilate also wrote an inscription and put it on the cross. It was written, Jesus the Nazarene, the King of the Jews. Therefore, many of the Jews read the inscription, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and it was written in Hebrew, Latin, and in Greek. So the chief priests of the Jews were saying to Pilate, do not write the King of the Jews, but that he said, I am King of the Jews. Pilate answered, what I have written, I have written.
Now, let's talk about that for a minute. What's going on there?
Actually, Pilate had a backbone for once in this whole situation that's going on of them crucifying him.
Okay, but what is the backbone about? The backbone is not about Jesus being guilty or innocent. The backbone is a slap at the Jews
Yes,
for killing or wanting to have killed their king.
yes,
So it's not a thing whether Jesus is guilty or innocent. It's basically a slap saying, I have crucified your king because you pressured me to do it.
yes,
And I'm not going to change what I have written. What I have written, I have written. And that's a slap at the high priest who says, don't write, just say he said he was the king. So Pilate has a backbone
only.
as far as a put down to the Jews, not as a result of legal, religious, or political pressure.
Yes,
If he would have had a backbone there, he would have said not guilty. But instead, he shows some resistance to the idea of putting down the Jews for demanding that he kill their innocent king,
yes,
that he find no guilt in. So literally, a non-guilty Jesus is found guilty because of the political pressure finally getting to Pilate, and he gives in because he's weak. And then he tries to reestablish some authority by saying what I've written. Now, the last 2 verses, verse 23 says, the soldiers, when they had crucified Jesus, took his other outer garments. Now, I want to switch over here to that verse. Okay, read the rest of 23, outer garments, and read and go right into verse 24.
and made 4 parts, a part to every soldier, and also the tunic. Now the tunic was seamless, woven in one piece. So they said to one another, let us not tear it, but cast lots for it, to decide whose it shall be. This was to fulfill the scripture. They divided my outer garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots.
Now, it's interesting, if you do a little background, you find out that the Roman soldiers who crucified people traditionally got their possessions. Basically, as a kind of a tip, they got to take their possessions. But it was very unusual to have their possessions be of enough value that the Romans didn't want to destroy them to break them up. His undergarment was of a single piece of handmade woven material, It was a great quality. And a Roman soldier did not want to have that destroyed. So they said, we got one good piece. The robes and all that stuff we're going to distribute. But we got one good piece, so we're going to throw dice. We're going to cast lots for it. That was the unusual portion. Flip over to Psalm 22, and let's look at verse 18.
They divided my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots.
Now, there was nothing surprising or prophetic about they divided my clothes, because Roman soldiers did that all the time. What is prophetic is that they had to cast lots or dice for the clothes. That was very unusual. And it fulfilled the detail, a tiny little detail in the crucifixion of Christ. And we're going to leave it there because next week we're going to go to Christ on the cross. I want to see what he was like on the cross. He's been crucified. He's naked. He's on the cross. And now we're going to talk next week on the significance of that. But basically what we see here is Pilate being a weak governor, but having a little backbone, but being used by God to get Jesus onto the cross to fulfill God's plan.
Yeah.
That's been God's plan since the Garden of Eden when man sinned and Jesus was foretold to the snake by saying, the seed of the woman is going to crush your head and you're going to bruise his heel. This is the bruise.
Yeah.
He's going to temporarily suffer on the cross to pay for the sins of the world.
Yes.
And we're going to leave it there and consider how many times we're like Pilate and we give in to pressure. Now, remember a couple of chapters ago,
Yes.
Peter denied the Lord based upon pressure, public pressure. Weren't you his follower, blah, blah, blah. And now we see pressure affecting a non-believer to the point of saying, he's not guilty, but I'm going to find him guilty and he's going to go to the cross, which was God's plan.
Yeah.
So we get a picture of Jesus sometimes as this poor vagabond preacher. No, he had some good quality stuff. Remember the women that supported him financially.
Yep.
That he had good quality clothes that to fulfill prophecy were good enough that his killers gambled for them. What a detail that we get in prophecy from Psalm 22. Well, we've been talking about the trial and crucifixion of Christ. And I want to recommend a video to you. It's called The Cross of Christ in Psalm 22. I talked about that earlier, and this is a great video. I hope you enjoy it. And if it is a blessing to you, hit the subscribe button and the like. That helps us with YouTube. And listen, we're going to continue in our study in John, getting towards the end, and we'll do that next week. And until then, God bless you.